Can you imagine losing everything you've ever known to the very man who should have protected you? A young woman, orphaned and penniless, cast out into the wilderness by her own blood, clutching nothing but an old wooden trunk her dying father begged her to keep. What she didn't know was that inside that battered chest lay the power to bring a tyrant to his knees. This happened on a sprawling cattle ranch in Harmony Valley, Maple Creek County, Pennsylvania, in the year 1888, a time when a man's word was supposed to be his bond and family was supposed to be sacred. But Grace O'Connell was about to learn that greed knows no kinship and that sometimes the smallest thing we carry holds the greatest truth. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button, because the ending of this story will surprise you in ways you never imagined. And tell me in the comments which city you are watching this from. Grace O'Connell was 28 years old in the spring of 1888, and her hands told the story of every season she'd ever known. Calloused from the plough, scarred from barbed wire, rough from scrubbing laundry in creek water so cold it made her bones ache. She was the only child of Thomas O'Connell, a decent man who'd worked a modest farm on the fertile hillside of Harmony Valley, where the soil was rich and black, and a natural spring bubbled up pure and cold from the limestone bedrock. That spring was worth more than gold in those parts. It never ran dry, not even in the dog days of August, when the sun beat down like the wrath of God and every other creek turned to cracked mud. Livestock for miles around depended on water hauled from that spring, and the vegetable gardens of half the county wouldn't have survived without it. Thomas O'Connell had never charged a cent for it. He believed water was God's gift, not something a man should profit from. But not everyone shared his convictions. Just across the property line stood Thornwood Estate, a sprawling manor house with white columns and manicured grounds that seemed to mock the humble O'Connell farm. It belonged to Grace's uncle, Colonel Alistair Thorne, a man of 62 years who wore his Confederate rank like a crown, even though the war had been over for more than 2 decades. The colonel was a landowner of considerable influence, a tobacco baron who controlled thousands of acres and employed dozens of sharecroppers under contracts that kept them perpetually in debt. He'd always wanted that spring. For years, Colonel Thorne had made offers to buy the O'Connell property. Each time Thomas refused. The farm had belonged to his father and his father before him, and he intended to pass it down to Grace. But as Thomas aged, a persistent cough settled deep in his chest, the kind that rattles and won't let go. By the winter of 1887, he was spitting blood into his handkerchief and could barely walk from the barn to the house without stopping to catch his breath. Grace nursed him through that terrible winter, brewing teas from willow bark and keeping the fire burning all night while the Pennsylvania cold pressed against the windows like something alive. She watched her father grow thinner, his skin taking on the grey pallor of wood ash, and on a bitter February morning, with ice crusting the window panes and Grace holding his hand, Thomas O'Connell took his last breath. He was 56 years old. His final words to his daughter were these: "Keep the chest, Gracie. Whatever happens, don't let them take the chest. Your grandfather made me promise, and now I'm making you promise. Keep it safe." Grace had nodded through her tears, not understanding, thinking only that grief makes people say strange things. The chest he spoke of was nothing special, just an old wooden trunk with brass corners, the kind every family had for storing winter blankets and moth-eaten quilts. Inside were her father's few possessions: a pair of worn leather boots, a pocket watch that no longer worked, a Bible with a cracked spine, and some yellowed letters tied with string. But Grace promised, because you don't break a promise to a dying man. The wake was held in the front parlour of the O'Connell farmhouse, as was proper. Neighbours came to pay their respects, bringing casseroles and pies, speaking in hushed voices about what a good man Thomas had been, how he'd never turned anyone away, how Grace would be all right because the community would look after her. They were wrong. Colonel Thorne didn't even wait for the burial. He arrived on the third day while Grace was still sitting beside her father's coffin, her eyes red and swollen from weeping. He didn't come alone. With him was Mr. Silas Finch, a weasel-faced lawyer of 43 years, who carried a leather satchel bulging with documents and wore a permanent sneer beneath his thin mustache. Grace heard the horses before she saw them, 4 riders approaching the house at a deliberate pace meant to intimidate. She stepped out onto the porch, still wearing her morning dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Uncle Alistair," she said, her voice hoarse, "this isn't the time." "On the contrary, niece," the colonel interrupted, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man whose joints had begun to betray him. "This is precisely the time. Business waits for no man's death, nor should it." He was an imposing figure, even in his 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair and a thick moustache waxed to sharp points. His eyes were the colour of creek water after a storm, cold and murky. He wore a black suit with a gold watch chain stretched across his vest, and he carried himself like a man who'd never heard the word no in his entire life. "I don't understand," Grace said, her heart beginning to pound. "What business?" Mr. Finch stepped forward, opening his satchel with theatrical precision. "Miss O'Connell, it has come to our attention that your late father was deeply indebted to Colonel Thorne. These debts were incurred over a period of several years, primarily for medical expenses, seed for planting, and various loans extended in good faith by the colonel to his brother-in-law." "That's a lie," Grace said, but her voice wavered. "Papa never borrowed from anyone. He always paid his way." "Do you have records to prove that?" Finch asked, raising an eyebrow. "Receipts? Ledgers? No? Then I'm afraid your word against documented evidence holds very little weight." The lawyer produced a sheaf of papers, yellowed with age and covered in her father's handwriting, or what looked like her father's handwriting. Promissory notes, IOUs, a mortgage agreement that allegedly put the entire O'Connell farm up as collateral. Grace's hands shook as she looked at them. "I've never seen these before. Papa would have told me—" "Your father was a proud man," Colonel Thorne said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Too proud to admit to his daughter that he was drowning in debt. But facts are facts, girl. Your father owed me nearly $8,000. This property is worth perhaps $3,000 at auction. I'm being exceedingly generous by agreeing to accept the land as payment in full, thereby forgiving the remaining balance." "You can't do this," Grace whispered. "This is my home. I was born in this house." "Not anymore," Finch said flatly. "As of this moment, you are trespassing on Colonel Thorne's property. However, the Colonel is a merciful man and a Christian gentleman. He will allow you 24 hours to remove your personal effects before the property is officially transferred." Grace felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "But where will I go? I have nothing, no money, no family except me," Colonel Thorne finished. "And I have offered you more kindness than you deserve. I could have you arrested for trespassing right now. Instead, I'm giving you time to gather your belongings and leave quietly. I suggest you don't waste it arguing." "As a merciful man," Thorne added with a cold smile, "I'll allow you to take your rags and that old wooden chest of your father's, so you remember where you came from." Grace wanted to scream, to fight, to summon the sheriff and demand justice. But she was a young woman alone, with no money for a lawyer and no proof to counter the documents Finch had produced. In 1888, in rural Pennsylvania, a woman's word, especially an orphaned farm girl's word, meant nothing against a man of Colonel Thorne's standing. The neighbors who'd promised to look after her suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. They averted their eyes when she passed them on the road. They closed their doors when she knocked, seeking advice. Colonel Thorne's influence reached into every corner of the valley, and no one wanted to risk his wrath by helping Thomas O'Connell's daughter. Grace was alone. She took what little she could carry: 2 changes of clothes, her mother's wedding ring, a few kitchen utensils, a tattered quilt, and the wooden chest her father had made her promise to keep. A neighbor who still had a shred of decency let her borrow a handcart, which she loaded with her meager possessions and pushed down the dirt road away from the only home she'd ever known. She looked back once. Already, Colonel Thorne's men were measuring the property, marking where they'd tear down the farmhouse to make room for expanded tobacco fields. The spring, her family's spring, would be diverted into irrigation channels that would feed Thornwood Estate's crops, making the colonel even wealthier. Grace found shelter in an abandoned log cabin at the edge of the woods, on unclaimed land that no one wanted, because the soil was too rocky for farming and too far from town to be convenient. The cabin was barely standing, 3 walls mostly intact, the 4th sagging inward, the roof more holes than shingles. Rain came through in a dozen places, and wind whistled through gaps in the logs wide enough to stick your hand through. But it was shelter, and beggars couldn't be choosers. She patched what she could with mud and moss, hung her quilt over the worst gaps, and made a crude bed from pine branches covered with her spare dress. The wooden chest became her table, her chair, and sometimes her pillow. A stray goat wandered into the clearing one day, probably escaped from someone's farm, and Grace kept it for milk and company. The winter of 1888 was merciless. Snow piled up to the windowsills, and Grace would wake some mornings to find ice crusted on the inside walls where her breath had frozen overnight. She wrapped herself in every piece of fabric she owned and still shivered until her teeth chattered. To survive, she took whatever work she could find. She washed laundry for the town's wealthy families, standing hip-deep in the creek even when ice formed along the edges, scrubbing other people's linens until her knuckles bled. She mended clothes, cleaned houses, and once spent 3 days mucking out stables for 50 cents and a sack of withered potatoes. The humiliation was worse than the cold. Grace had to smile and curtsy to women who'd once been her equals, had to endure their pitying looks and whispered gossip. She'd see them in town, walking arm in arm, pointedly turning away when she approached, and from a distance she watched as Colonel Thorne tore down her childhood home. The walls came down in a single afternoon, reduced to lumber and rubble. Her father's fields were ploughed under and replanted with tobacco. The spring was enclosed in a brick cistern with a locked gate, and a sign was posted, "Thornwood Estate property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The villain had won. Grace O'Connell had been erased from Harmony Valley as thoroughly as if she'd never existed, or so it seemed. One night in March of 1889, more than a year after her father's death, a storm rolled through the valley with a fury that felt personal. Thunder cracked like artillery fire, and rain came down in sheets so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. The cabin's roof, already compromised, gave way entirely in 2 places. Water poured in, turning the dirt floor to mud. Grace huddled in the driest corner, watching helplessly as her few possessions got soaked. The wooden chest, which she'd been using as a pillow, was directly beneath one of the leaks. By morning, it was drenched, the old wood swollen and warped from the moisture. She dragged it near the fireplace to dry, frustrated and exhausted. As the heat from the fire began to work on the soaked wood, she noticed something strange. The bottom of the chest was starting to separate, the planks pulling apart as the swollen wood contracted unevenly. Grace frowned, running her fingers along the seam. It didn't feel like normal splitting. It felt deliberate, like the bottom had been designed to come apart. She grabbed her kitchen knife, more of a dull blade than anything useful, and carefully pried at the wood. With a crack, the false bottom gave way. And there, glued to the underside of that false bottom, was an oilskin envelope, perfectly preserved despite its years of hiding. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were 2 documents that would change everything. The first was a letter, written in her grandfather's careful hand, dated 1852, 37 years earlier. Grace read it by firelight, her eyes widening with each sentence. To my son Thomas, and to his children after him. If you are reading this, then the truth can no longer be hidden. The land known as Thornwood Estate does not belong to Alistair Thorne. Though he has claimed it these many years, it belongs to our family by right of patent granted by the territorial governor in 1798. When my brother Alistair returned from his travels out west, he came home broke and desperate. I took pity on him and made him administrator of the estate while I tended to other business in Philadelphia. It was my great mistake. While I was gone, Alistair forged documents claiming the property had been sold to him, and when I returned, he had the local authorities so thoroughly in his pocket that I could not prove my case without endangering the family. Rather than see bloodshed, I took the smaller parcel, what is now called the O'Connell Farm, and pretended to accept defeat. But I kept the original land patent, the one document that proves the truth. It is enclosed here, along with something else Alistair believes was lost forever, a map to the location of our mother's jewels, which he has searched for these 40 years. Guard these documents with your life. When the time is right, when you have the strength and allies to fight him, use them. Reclaim what is rightfully yours. Your father, Patrick O'Connell. Grace's breath caught in her throat. With shaking hands, she unfolded the second document. It was exactly what her grandfather had promised, an original land patent, signed by Governor Thomas Mifflin himself, granting 500 acres, including everything that was now Thornwood Estate, to Patrick O'Connell and his heirs in perpetuity. The description of the boundaries was precise and undeniable. Colonel Thorne's entire empire was built on a lie. But there was more. Tucked behind the patent was a hand-drawn map, remarkably detailed, showing the layout of the old estate chapel, a small stone building that still stood in a grove of oak trees behind the main house. The map marked a specific location beneath the floorboards. Mother's safe, family jewels, hidden 1814. Grace sat back, her mind reeling. Her grandfather had known. Her father had known. They'd hidden the truth, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to finally expose Colonel Thorne for the fraud and thief he was. That person was her. But Grace was no fool. She couldn't simply march up to Thornwood Estate, waving these documents and expect justice. The local sheriff, Marshal Wade Dockery, dined at the colonel's table every Sunday. The county judge had received campaign contributions from Thorne for the past 15 years. Every person of influence in Harmony Valley was either afraid of the colonel or in his debt. If she tried to fight him here, she'd end up in jail, or worse, dead in a ditch with her death ruled an unfortunate accident. No, Grace needed help, real help, the kind that Colonel Thorne's influence couldn't reach. There was only one person in Harmony Valley that Grace trusted completely, Caleb Stone, a 30-year-old former wagon master who now ran an honest general store on the edge of town. Caleb was tall and lean, with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that knew hard work. He'd always been sweet on Grace, even when she was just Thomas O'Connell's daughter, and he was a young man saving money to start his business. When Grace showed up at his store the next morning, still muddy from the storm, clutching the oilskin envelope to her chest, Caleb took one look at her face and locked the door. "What happened?" he asked. Grace told him everything. She showed him the documents, watched his eyes widen as he read the letter, traced the boundaries on the land patent with his finger. "Good Lord," Caleb breathed. "Grace, this is everything. This proves he stole the estate from your family." "I know," Grace said, "but who's going to believe me? Who's going to stand up to Colonel Thorne?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he said, "Philadelphia." "What?" "There's a lawyer in Philadelphia, name of Arthur Caldwell. He's 52, maybe 53 now. He made his reputation taking on land barons and corrupt officials. Doesn't care how rich they are or how much influence they have. If the law is on your side, he'll fight for you. I can't afford a lawyer like that, Grace said. I can barely afford bread. You let me worry about that, Caleb said firmly. I've got some money saved, and if this goes the way I think it will, you'll be able to pay me back 100-fold. Besides, he looked at her with an expression that made Grace's cheeks warm. I'm not about to let you face this alone. 3 days later, Grace and Caleb boarded a train to Philadelphia. Grace wore the best dress Caleb had bought her from his own store. Nothing fancy, but clean and respectable. The wooden chest, now carefully repaired, went with them, along with the precious documents hidden inside. Philadelphia was like nothing Grace had ever seen. Buildings 5 and 6 stories tall, streets packed with carriages and people, noise and smoke, and the constant clatter of industry. Caleb led her through the maze of streets to a modest brick office building near Independence Hall. The sign on the door read, Arthur Caldwell, Attorney at Law, Land Rights and Civil Justice. Caldwell himself was a distinguished man of 52 with silver hair, sharp blue eyes behind spectacles, and the air of someone who'd argued before judges so many times that courtrooms felt like home. He listened to Grace's story without interruption, examining the documents with the careful attention of a jeweler appraising diamonds. When she finished, he set the papers down and looked at her directly. Miss O'Connell, he said, I won't lie to you. This will be a fight. Your uncle has resources, connections, and decades of apparent legitimacy on his side. But these documents, he tapped the land patent, these are ironclad. If we do this right, if we gather supporting evidence and present this case properly, we can destroy him. How long will it take? Grace asked. Months, Caldwell said honestly. We'll need to file motions, subpoena county records, possibly bring in federal marshals if local law enforcement is compromised. But Miss O'Connell, I want you to understand something. I don't take cases I don't believe in, and I don't lose cases where justice is on my side. Your grandfather was smart to preserve this evidence. Now we're going to use it. Over the next 6 months, Attorney Caldwell worked tirelessly. He filed claims with the Federal Land Office, subpoenaed records from Maple Creek County going back 50 years, and discovered a pattern of forgeries and fraudulent documents surrounding Colonel Thorne's acquisition of Thornwood Estate. He found testimony from elderly residents who remembered when Patrick O'Connell was the true owner, and he documented Alastair Thorne's suspicious rise from penniless wanderer to wealthy landowner in the span of a single year. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Colonel Alastair Thorne was a fraud and a thief who had stolen his own brother's inheritance and spent 4 decades profiting from that crime. Grace stayed in Philadelphia during this time, working as a seamstress to pay for her room and board. Caleb traveled back and forth, managing his store, but spending every free moment helping with the case. Their bond deepened during those months, growing from friendship into something more, though neither spoke of it yet, both knowing that there would be time for such things once the battle was won. And then, in September of 1889, Attorney Caldwell received the document he'd been waiting for, a federal court order demanding the immediate seizure and audit of all property records related to Thornwood Estate, along with an arrest warrant for Colonel Alastair Thorne on charges of fraud, forgery, and theft of federal land patents. It was time to go home. Colonel Thorne had no idea what was coming. In his mind, he'd won completely. The O'Connell girl was gone, forgotten, probably dead in a ditch somewhere. The spring was his, the land was his, and he was preparing to announce his candidacy for state senator at the annual Harvest Festival. A grand celebration held every September on the grounds of Thornwood Estate. The festival was the social event of the season. The entire valley attended. Farmers and merchants, townspeople and gentry, all gathered on the manicured lawns of the estate to eat roasted pig, drink apple cider, and dance to fiddle music as the sun set over the hills. Colonel Thorne stood on a raised platform, resplendent in a new suit, his chest puffed out with pride as he prepared to give his speech. Behind him, the white columns of Thornwood Manor gleamed in the golden afternoon light. Before him, hundreds of people applauded and cheered, because that's what you did when Colonel Thorne was watching. The music was lively, the laughter genuine, and Thorne was just opening his mouth to speak when a sound cut through the festivities like a knife through butter, the approach of multiple carriages moving fast. The music stopped. Heads turned. 4 black carriages came rolling up the main drive, dust billowing behind them. They weren't local vehicles. These were official conveyances, marked with federal seals. They pulled to a stop directly in front of the platform, and a squadron of U.S. Marshals stepped out, their badges gleaming in the sunlight. The crowd murmured nervously. Colonel Thorne's smile faltered, and then the door of the lead carriage opened, and Grace O'Connell stepped out. She was transformed. No longer the bedraggled, mud-stained girl who'd been driven from her home. Grace now wore a fine traveling dress of deep green, her auburn hair elegantly styled, her bearing confident and proud. Behind her came Caleb Stone, dressed in a proper suit, and Attorney Arthur Caldwell, carrying a leather case bulging with documents. The crowd gasped. Whispers rippled through the assembly like wind through wheat. "That's Thomas O'Connell's daughter. I thought she was dead. What's she doing here?" Grace walked forward, her eyes locked on her uncle. Colonel Thorne's face had gone pale, then flushed red with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice booming across the lawn. "This is private property. You are all trespassing." Attorney Caldwell stepped forward, his voice calm and clear. "On the contrary, Colonel, it is you who are trespassing. By order of the Federal District Court of Pennsylvania, I am here to inform you that your claim to this property has been found fraudulent and void." He held up the land patent for all to see. "This document, signed by Governor Thomas Mifflin in 1798, grants these lands to Patrick O'Connell and his heirs. That heir," he gestured to Grace, "is Miss Grace O'Connell, the sole surviving descendant and rightful owner of this estate." The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations. Colonel Thorne's face twisted with rage. "That's a lie," he roared. "I have documents proving—" "You have forgeries," Caldwell interrupted smoothly, "which we have thoroughly documented. You also have an extensive history of coercing signatures, bribing officials, and falsifying county records, all of which has been presented to the federal court." One of the marshals stepped forward, producing a folded paper from his coat. "Colonel Alistair Thorne, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, theft of federal lands, and conspiracy to commit perjury. You have the right to—" "You can't do this!" Thorne bellowed, backing away. He looked around wildly at his hired men, the workers who depended on his paycheck, the neighbors who'd feared him for so long. "Stop them! They're criminals, liars!" But no one moved to help him. The workers had endured his cruelty too long, and the neighbors had seen the truth written on Attorney Caldwell's face and in Grace's steady gaze. Mr. Silas Finch, the weasel lawyer, tried to slink away through the crowd, but 2 marshals intercepted him. He too was arrested, his satchel of forged documents seized as evidence. Colonel Thorne made one last desperate play. He turned and ran toward the main house, probably intending to barricade himself inside or destroy evidence. But he was 63 years old and not in the best health. The marshals caught him before he reached the steps, tackling him to the ground with all the dignity of a pig being roped for slaughter. They hauled him to his feet, clapping iron manacles around his wrists. The mighty Colonel Alistair Thorne, land baron, would-be senator, tyrant of Harmony Valley, was led away in chains, while hundreds of people watched in stunned silence. Grace stood watching, her face calm but her heart pounding. Caleb took her hand, squeezing gently. "It's over," he said softly. "You won." But Grace shook her head slightly. "Not quite yet. There's one more thing." That evening, after the shocked festival-goers had dispersed and the marshals had taken Colonel Thorne and Mr. Finch to Philadelphia to face federal charges, Grace returned to the estate with Caleb and Attorney Caldwell. She carried her grandfather's map, the one pointing to the old chapel in the oak grove. The chapel was small and stone, built in 1801 by her great-great-grandfather as a place of family worship. It hadn't been used in decades. Colonel Thorne had always been suspicious of religion, claiming it made men weak. The door creaked on rusty hinges as Grace pushed it open. Inside, moonlight streamed through broken stained glass, illuminating dusty pews and a simple altar. Grace studied the map, counting stones from the altar, measuring paces to the left. "Here," she said, pointing to a specific floorboard. Caleb produced a crowbar, and together they pried up the ancient wood. Beneath, in a hollow space that had been hidden for 75 years, was a small iron safe, its surface crusted with rust. It took 20 minutes and considerable effort, but they finally broke the lock. The safe's lid swung open. Inside was a black velvet bag, remarkably well preserved in its sealed chamber. Grace lifted it carefully, untied the drawstring, and poured the contents onto a clean cloth Caleb had spread on the floor. Jewels spilled out like captured starlight, a diamond necklace that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, brought from Ireland in 1790, emerald earrings, ruby brooches, a sapphire ring the size of a robin's egg, gold chains and pearl strands. The accumulated wealth of 3 generations, hidden away to protect it from bandits and war, then forgotten when the man who hid it died suddenly without revealing the location. Colonel Thorne had torn the estate apart, looking for these jewels over the years, convinced they existed but never finding them. Now they belonged to Grace, along with everything else. Attorney Caldwell let out a low whistle. "Miss O'Connell, you're not just rightful owner of this land. You're a wealthy woman." Grace looked at the jewels, then at the chapel, then out the broken window at the sprawling estate that now belonged to her. She thought of her father, dying in poverty while his brother lived in luxury stolen from their family. She thought of all the people Colonel Thorne had crushed under his boot over the years, the tenant farmers trapped in debt, the workers paid in scrip instead of real money, the families evicted when they couldn't meet impossible quotas. She made her decision. The trial of Colonel Alistair Thorne was swift and brutal. With the mountain of evidence Attorney Caldwell had assembled, there was no possibility of acquittal. Thorne was convicted on 11 counts of fraud and theft, sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in Eastern State Penitentiary. Mr. Silas Finch received 8 years as an accomplice. The assets were liquidated to pay restitution. Thornwood Estate, legally returned to Grace O'Connell, became the center of a revolution in Harmony Valley. Grace's first act as the true lady of the lands was to release every sharecropper and tenant farmer from their contracts with the estate. She divided the tobacco fields into 40-acre parcels and sold them, not for market price, but for what struggling families could actually afford, with generous payment plans and no interest. The spring, that precious water source her father had always believed should be free, was declared public property. Grace had a communal well built, with pumps accessible to anyone in the valley, free of charge. The manor house itself underwent a transformation. Grace kept a modest apartment for herself on the 2nd floor, but the rest of the building became something the valley had never had before, a proper school. She used the money from the jewels to hire 3 teachers from Philadelphia and to stock a library with hundreds of books. Children from miles around, regardless of their parents' ability to pay, were welcome to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. The old wooden chest, the one that had held the secrets for so long, was placed in a glass case in the school's main hall. Grace had a brass plaque made that read, "True wealth is not what we claim, but what we preserve with honor." This chest belonged to Thomas O'Connell, an honest man who taught his daughter that justice is patient, but it never forgets. Let it remind all who see it that truth, though buried, always finds a way to the surface. As for Grace herself, she married Caleb Stone in the spring of 1890 in the chapel where they'd found the hidden jewels. It was a simple ceremony, attended by every family in Harmony Valley, the same people who'd once turned their backs on her when she had nothing. They had 3 children together, and Grace lived to the age of 84, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1944. By then, the O'Connell School had educated 2 generations of Valley children, many of whom went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and honest business people, who transformed Harmony Valley from a place of fear and oppression into a community known throughout Pennsylvania for its integrity and mutual support. Colonel Alistair Thorne died in prison in 1897, having served 8 years of his sentence. He left no heirs, no legacy, and no mourners. His name became a cautionary tale parents told their children about what happens when greed consumes a man's soul. The irony was perfect and complete. The man who'd stolen everything ended with nothing, while the woman he'd left homeless became the greatest benefactor the valley had ever known. There's an old saying in the mountains of Pennsylvania, the mill of God grinds slowly, but it grinds exceedingly fine. It means that justice might take its time, but when it finally arrives, it's thorough and complete. Grace O'Connell could have become bitter. She could have used her restored wealth and power to exact revenge, to crush those who turned their backs on her, to become the same kind of tyrant her uncle had been. But she understood something that Colonel Thorne never learned. Real power isn't measured by what you can take from others, but by what you can give. Her father's final words, "Keep the chest," weren't just about preserving evidence. They were about preserving truth, integrity, and faith that righteousness would eventually prevail. That battered wooden trunk, soaked by a storm and revealing its secrets only when the time was right, became a symbol of something profound, that what we carry forward from our ancestors matters more than what we accumulate for ourselves. The spring that Colonel Thorne coveted so desperately still flows today, more than 130 years later. There's a stone marker beside it, erected by Grace's grandchildren, that reads, "Water is God's gift, freely given. May it always flow free." And every year, on the anniversary of the day Grace returned to claim her inheritance, the O'Connell School holds a harvest festival on the grounds of what was once Thornwood Estate. Children play in the oak grove near the chapel. Families share food on the lawn where Colonel Thorne once stood in his pride. And somewhere in the main hall, behind glass, an old wooden chest with a false bottom reminds everyone who sees it that truth is patient, justice is inevitable, and the smallest inheritance, a promise, a secret, a box of old letters, can contain the power to change the world. And you, what would you have done in Grace O'Connell's place? Would you have had the courage to fight against such powerful corruption? Would you have chosen mercy and generosity over revenge? Tell me in the comments. I Continue 22 want to hear your thoughts. If you liked this story, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next incredible tale of justice and redemption from America's past. Click now on the next video I'm recommending, because you won't believe what happens when a dying prospector leaves behind a map that 3 brothers will kill for.